The clock on the dashboard of the unmarked cruiser read 5:11 a.m. when Officer Brett Kaminsky grabbed Nurse Lena Sorrel by the collar and slammed her against the hood hard enough to knock the breath out of her. Her medical bag hit the gravel and split open, gauze, syringes, a blood pressure cuff skidding across the driveway of the Blackridge estate like debris from a wreck. 32 federal agents stood in a perimeter around the $18 million property, weapons drawn, radios crackling, and not one of them moved to stop what was happening. Kaminsky tore the badge from her lanyard and held it up to the floodlights. "A nurse," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear, and then he laughed. "You wandered into a federal operation because of a nurse call." He tossed her badge into the dark and reached for his cuffs. Lena didn't scream. She didn't beg. She turned her head slowly and looked at the mansion, really looked at it, and noticed three things that nobody else on that driveway had noticed yet. Then she said quietly, almost to herself, "This isn't a residence." Behind her, deep beneath 17,000 square feet of imported marble and hand-carved oak, an alarm began counting down. If this story is already pulling you in, stay with me, because what happens next is going to shake everything you think you know about who holds the real power in a room. Subscribe to my channel so you don't miss a single part of this series, hit like if you want more stories like this, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. She had been awake since 3. The call came through the Dunmore Regional Dispatch at 3:47 a.m. Not to Lena directly, but to the on-call coordinator at Halverson Medical Center, who then pushed it to Lena because she was the only trauma-certified nurse on the roster who also held an active hazardous environment clearance. The message was brief. Reports of a man down inside the Blackridge estate, possible blunt trauma, possibly unconscious. The estate's private medical contact had been unreachable. Local police had been notified. The coordinator had told Lena it was probably nothing, probably some overworked domestic staff member who had fainted, maybe a slip and fall. Probably nothing. Lena had learned a long time ago that probably nothing was the phrase people used right before something became very much something. She drove her own car. The estate was 22 miles outside of Ravenport, Minnesota, past the junction at Route 9 and down a private road that wasn't on any of the public navigation apps. She had looked it up using the County Property Index, which still listed the estate under the name of a Cayman Islands holding company. It had taken her 11 minutes to find the right entry road. She arrived at 5:04 a.m. and saw immediately that this was not a routine wellness check. There were vehicles everywhere, black SUVs without plates, 2 tactical vans, a mobile command unit humming with generator power, and 3 separate teams of agents moving in formation across the property. Floodlights had been rigged to temporary poles, bathing the entire front of the estate in harsh white light that turned everything flat and slightly unreal, like a film set. Lena parked on the shoulder of the private road, well behind the perimeter tape, and approached on foot with her bag over her shoulder and her hospital ID clipped to her jacket. She was stopped before she reached the tape. The officer who stopped her was young, mid-20s, crew cut, wearing a county sheriff's department jacket over tactical gear. He didn't introduce himself. He looked at her ID, then at her bag, then back at her face, and said, "Ma'am, you need to turn around." "I received a call about an injured person on this property," Lena said. "I'm a trauma nurse from Halverson Medical." "There's no injured person here." The call came through County Dispatch at 3:47. Dispatch made an error. "This site is closed." "Who authorized the closure?" He didn't answer that. He just pointed back down the road. "Turn around, ma'am." Lena had dealt with this before, not often, but enough times to recognize the specific quality of obstruction that came from someone following an order they didn't fully understand. She tried a different angle. "Is there a supervising agent I can speak with? If there's an injured person on the premises and I'm turned away without verification, I have a legal obligation to document." "Lady." He stepped closer. "I'm not going to tell you again." She stepped back. Not because she was afraid, because she had counted 3 other officers within 20 feet, 2 of whom had noticed the exchange and were starting to drift over, and she needed to assess the full situation before she pushed any further. She went back to her car and sat for a moment, watching. The activity around the main entrance had intensified. She could see agents moving in tight clusters, radios raised. One team was working along the eastern side of the mansion, following the exterior wall with what looked like ground-penetrating equipment. Another was staged near a detached structure at the north end of the property, some kind of carriage house or secondary outbuilding. And then there was the thing she'd noticed on her initial approach, driving slowly past the estate before she turned around and came back. The ventilation infrastructure. 3 separate exhaust shafts protruding from the landscaped embankment on the south side of the property, spaced at intervals that didn't match any residential HVAC layout she had ever seen. They matched a different kind of layout entirely, one she had learned to identify years ago, in a context that had nothing to do with nursing. She picked up her bag and walked back toward the tape. This time she got closer before anyone stopped her. She had timed her approach to coincide with a radio burst that pulled 3 nearby officers toward the command van, and she came in from an angle that kept her behind a parked SUV until she was already within the outer perimeter. It was a small thing. She wasn't trying to infiltrate a federal operation. She genuinely needed to know if someone inside was injured. But the training that let her time a room, read exit vectors, and move through a crowd without drawing attention, that training didn't switch off just because she was wearing scrubs. She had almost reached the mansion's side entrance when Officer Brett Kaminsky found her. He was heavy-set, mid-40s, and he moved fast for his size. He grabbed her arm before she could speak, and in the next 2 seconds she was facing the hood of the nearest cruiser with her wrists being wrenched behind her back. It happened with the casual efficiency of someone who had done it many times and expected no consequences. "You want to tell me what you think you're doing?" Kaminsky said. "I'm a nurse. I was called to this address for a medical emergency. You're trespassing on a federal operation. I'm responding to a documented dispatch call. I have the record on my phone." He pressed her harder against the hood. "I don't care what's on your phone." The badge came off her lanyard in one sharp pull. He held it up and turned it toward the agents who had gathered, maybe 8 or 10 of them now, watching. "A nurse," he announced. "Somebody want to tell me how a nurse from—" He squinted at the badge. "Halverson Medical wandered through our perimeter at 5 in the morning?" Nobody answered. A few of the agents looked at each other. One of them, Lena noticed, looked at her with a specific expression. Not contempt, not amusement, but something that registered more like recognition. He was older than the others, maybe 55, wearing a gray tactical jacket without insignia. He was standing farther back near the command van, and when Lena made eye contact with him, he looked away immediately. She filed that away. Kaminsky cuffed her hands in front and walked her back toward the tape. "I'm citing you for unlawful entry and obstruction," he said, "and I'm calling your hospital." He said that last part like it was the real punishment. "You'll be lucky if you still have a job by 7 o'clock. "There's a man inside who needed medical help," Lena said. "There's nobody inside who needs anything from you." "Then why are there ground-penetrating sensors along your eastern perimeter?" Kaminsky stopped walking. He turned and looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time. His expression was difficult to read. Some combination of irritation and something else, something like the first edge of unease. "Sit down," he said, and pointed at the running board of the nearest cruiser. She sat. She was still cuffed. Around her the operation continued, agents moving, radios crackling, the mobile command van emitting a constant low hum. The sky to the east was beginning to lighten, that gray pre-dawn color that turns the world into a silhouette. Lena sat straight and watched the mansion and waited, because she was very good at waiting, and because the things she'd noticed, the 3 ventilation shafts, the camera placement that didn't match residential security logic, the convoy route she'd mapped in her head driving up the private road, those details weren't going anywhere. Her phone buzzed inside her jacket pocket. She couldn't reach it with her hands cuffed, but she already knew who it was. Her supervisor, Darren Coyle, had a habit of monitoring dispatch logs during overnight shifts, and if Kaminsky had already made the call he'd promised, Coyle would be awake and furious. Coyle had a complicated relationship with Furious. He defaulted to it quickly and departed from it slowly, and his most reliable trigger was anything that threatened the hospital's relationship with Ravenport's moneyed class. The Blackridge estate and its owner were not a relationship Halverson Medical could afford to damage. The call went to voicemail. Then her phone buzzed again, then a third time. 20 minutes passed. The eastern sky went from gray to pale pink. A cold wind came off the tree line and Lena pulled her jacket tighter with her cuffed hands, which took more effort than it should have. Somewhere inside the mansion, a secondary alarm tripped. She could hear it through the stone exterior walls, a different pitch than the first, more urgent. Two agents broke into a jog toward the main entrance. Then the radio on Kaminsky's belt erupted with something she couldn't quite make out, and Kaminsky strode away from her without a word. She watched the entrance. A stretcher came out first. She was on her feet before she fully realized she'd moved. The agent on the stretcher was conscious, but barely. She could see the effort it took him to keep his eyes open, could see from 40 feet away the particular color of a person in autonomic distress, that grayish pallor and the slight blue tinge at the lips that meant his body was fighting something it didn't understand. Two other agents were moving with him, but moving wrong, too fast, no rhythm, no coordination. They hadn't stabilized his airway. They were going to jostle him into aspiration. "Stop," Lena said. Nobody stopped. She crossed the distance in a straight line. "Stop. You're going to kill him if you keep moving him like that." She pushed between the two agents handling the stretcher and got her hands on the agent's jaw before anyone could pull her back. She tilted his head, cleared the airway manually, and checked his pupils in one smooth motion. Pupils are unequal. He's been exposed to something. Chemical, not physical. What was he near inside? For half a second, everyone around her froze. "What was he near?" she said again, sharper. "There was a sealed container in the sub-basement," one of the agents said. "It cracked open when—" "What kind of container?" "We don't know yet. Maybe solvents. Maybe something else." Lena had her bag open on the gravel before she consciously decided to open it. Her hands moved through the contents with the kind of efficiency that comes from thousands of hours of practice in conditions far worse than a gravel driveway at dawn. She pulled a nasal cannula, an ampule of a reversal agent that she carried for exactly this category of unknown exposure, and a blood pressure cuff, and she started working. Nobody stopped her this time. She talked as she worked, partly to keep the agent grounded and partly because she needed information fast. "Can you hear me? Stay with me. I need you to blink twice if you can hear my voice." He blinked. "Good. I need you to tell me if you smell anything. Describe it. Chemical smell, sweet smell, nothing?" "Bitter," he managed. His voice was barely there. "Bitter and cold. Like it had a cold smell." "Cyanide derivative," she said, mostly to herself. She looked up at the nearest agent. "I need activated charcoal if you have any in your medical kit, and I need it now. If you don't have charcoal, I need sodium thiosulfate. Check your hazmat support vehicle." "We don't—" "Check the vehicle." The instruction came out with a specific quality of authority that she hadn't intended and couldn't fully suppress. It was the kind of voice that didn't allow for hesitation, and the agent she was looking at heard it and moved. She got the agent's pressure stabilized over the next 4 minutes. It was rough and imperfect. She was working with field equipment on gravel, with her wrists still technically constrained by cuffs. She'd managed to work to the front during the stretcher intervention. The chemical exposure had been partial rather than full, which helped. She pushed fluids, cleared the airway again, and monitored his respiratory rate with 2 fingers on his wrist and her eyes on his chest, counting. Not smooth, not clinical. Real, physical, imprecise medicine on a cold driveway with bad light and not enough equipment and 4 people watching her like they were seeing something they couldn't categorize. Kaminsky was one of them. When the agent's color started returning and his breath steadied into something regular, Lena sat back on her heels and took a long breath. She was sweating under her jacket despite the cold. Her knees were going to ache tomorrow. She became aware gradually that the crowd around her had grown. Not just agents from the immediate perimeter, but people filtering over from the command van, from the entry teams, drawn by whatever they'd seen or been told over the radio. The man in the gray jacket without insignia was there. He was standing 3 feet from the edge of the crowd, and he was looking at her with an expression that was no longer anything like recognition. It was something more specific than that now, something like confirmation. He had his hand on his radio. Lena slowly stood. She brushed gravel off her knees. She looked at Kaminsky, who had not said a word in the last 6 minutes, and she said, "The cuffs." Kaminsky looked at the agent on the stretcher. He looked at Lena. He unclipped his keys with a motion that had the stiffness of someone performing an action they deeply resent but cannot argue against. The cuffs came off. She put her wrists together briefly and looked at the marks before she let her arms drop. Her phone buzzed again. She pulled it out and looked at the screen. Coil. She answered. "Lena, Coyle's voice was the voice of a man who had already made a decision and was calling to deliver it, not discuss it. I need you to step away from the Blackridge property immediately. The estate's legal office has contacted the hospital, and I just saved a federal agent from a cyanide exposure, Lena said. Brief silence. Regardless, Coyle said, and the word carried the full weight of his cowardice. The directive from administration is that Halverson Medical has no business at that address. You were not authorized to respond, and your presence there creates a liability issue that... Darren, your badge access is being suspended pending review. Please return to the city. He hung up. She stood with the phone in her hand and looked at the mansion. The sun had cleared the tree line by now, and the floodlights had been switched off, and in the natural morning light the estate looked different, less like money and more like architecture designed to conceal. The wings were asymmetrical in a way that served no aesthetic purpose. The eastern section was larger than any residential need could explain. The loading area at the north end of the property, visible now in the light, had reinforced bay doors. This wasn't a residence. She had said it quietly before, almost to herself. She understood it with more certainty now. She was still standing there, processing, when the first of the new vehicles turned onto the private road. It came in without lights or sirens, which was somehow more alarming than if it had come in screaming. Then a second, then four more in fast succession, and these were different from the county and local vehicles already on site, larger, darker, bearing small coded markings that she hadn't seen on civilian federal vehicles before, but recognized from a different context entirely. Behind them came two military transport trucks and a satellite communication vehicle, and behind those, an unmarked black van that parked directly in front of the command unit already on site. The agents around Lena went quiet. 3 figures stepped out of the black van. They moved with the coordinated economy of people who operate in high-threat environments as a matter of routine. Not performing, not posturing, just efficient. The one in the center wore civilian clothes, no insignia, and he walked directly to the existing command van without looking at anyone. The 2 flanking him peeled off to either side of the perimeter, already talking into earpieces. Then a 4th person stepped out of the van. He was tall, broad across the shoulders, wearing a jacket that bore no markings she could read at this distance. He stood for a moment outside the vehicle and scanned the full perimeter in a slow sweep, the kind of sweep that takes in every detail and catalogs everything without showing that it's doing so. His gaze moved across the agents, the cruisers, the stretcher where the injured agent was now being tended by a second medic who had arrived from one of the new vehicles. His gaze stopped on Lena. He came toward her at a measured walk. She didn't move. She hadn't moved from the spot where Coyle's call had ended. She watched him come, and she tried to read what she could from his bearing, his eye contact, the particular set of his shoulders. He stopped 6 feet from her and said, "Lena Sorrel, not a question." "Yes," she said. "I'm Commander Dale Westbrook, Joint Operations, Classified Domestic Task Force. We've been looking for you for 11 months. He paused, and something crossed his expression that wasn't quite an apology, but was adjacent to it. "We need to talk about what's underneath this building." Behind her, she heard Kaminsky exhale, a long, slow breath that carried in it the dawning awareness of exactly how badly he'd misjudged the situation. Lena didn't look back at him. She kept her eyes on Westbrook and said, "Tell me what you found." "Sub-basement," he said. 3 levels down. It's not residential infrastructure." "I know," she said. "How?" "The ventilation shafts on the south embankment, the camera mount angles, the convoy routing on the private road. It's not designed for residential traffic. It's designed for systematic movement of large cargo." She paused. "And the construction timeline doesn't match the permits. Whatever's down there was built after the public build was completed. Separate contractors, separate materials chain." Westbrook looked at her for a long moment. "You pulled that from a driveway in the dark," he said. "I had about 20 minutes sitting on a cruiser bumper," she said. "I used them." He almost smiled. It didn't quite make it. "We need your eyes inside," he said. "What we found on the first level of the sub-basement, the chemical compound, the container layout, the medical equipment stored down there. You're going to be able to read that faster than anyone we have on site." "I'm not a federal agent," she said. "No," he agreed. "But you were a captain in the 14th Classified Rescue Unit, with active time in 3 overseas deployments, specialized training in clandestine medical operations, and a specific certification in the identification of illicit medical infrastructure. He held her gaze. So when I say we need your eyes inside, I mean we need your specific eyes, not just any medic. She looked past him at the mansion, at the bay doors on the north end, at the south embankment where the ventilation shafts caught the morning light. Who else knows, she said. About you, right now, in my unit? Myself and two others. He glanced briefly in the direction of the man in the gray jacket, who was watching them from 40 feet away. And him? Who is he? He's been embedded in Rourke's operation for 14 months, Westbrook said quietly. He saw you working on Agent Ferris just now. He's the one who confirmed your identity to me. Lena absorbed that. Victor Rourke. The name had appeared on the county property index as the listed occupant, not the Cayman Islands holding company that technically owned the building, but Rourke as the named resident. She knew the name peripherally. Everyone in Ravenport knew the name. The Rourke Foundation had donated the new pediatric wing at Halverson Medical 4 years ago. His photograph was on a plaque in the lobby. What's underneath the building? She said. What we've found so far, Westbrook said carefully, suggests that the Black Ridge estate has been functioning as the nerve center of an operation that crosses at least 7 states, involves multiple criminal categories, and has been running for at minimum 6 years under a cover structure sophisticated enough that 3 separate federal agencies missed it during routine financial surveillance. How many people? We don't know yet. The servers are encrypted, the ledgers are coded. We need someone who can read the medical component of what's down there, the equipment, the compounds, the record-keeping system, and tell us what it was being used for. He looked at her steadily. And we need it done in the next 2 hours before this scene gets any larger and the lawyers arrive. Lena looked at the ground for a moment. She thought about Coyle's voice on the phone. She thought about her badge sitting somewhere in the dark gravel where Kaminsky had thrown it. She thought about the agent on the stretcher, his color coming back, his breathing steadying, because she had been in the right place at the right time and had not walked away when someone told her to. She picked up her bag. Show me the access point, she said. They moved toward the mansion at a pace that was just short of urgent. Westbrook walked beside her, 2 agents from his unit falling in behind. Kaminsky was somewhere in her peripheral vision, standing very still, watching her go. She didn't acknowledge him. She had already moved him to a category of problem that would resolve itself without her involvement. The main entrance had been propped open by a tactical wedge, and inside the mansion was a different world. Marble floors and cathedral ceilings, and the kind of furniture that costs more than most people's cars. And over all of it, the organized chaos of a live federal operation. Agents moved through the rooms with systematic purpose, photographing, cataloging, bagging. The main staircase had an evidence tape barrier at its base. The library doors at the end of the main hall were open, and she could see from the entry foyer that the shelving unit on the library's interior east wall had been swung out on a pivot mechanism, revealing the access stairwell behind it. The stairwell went down. She had seen that construction before, twice, in classified site assessments during her service. Both times, the facilities below had been doing things that no surface-level inspection was designed to catch. She followed Westbrook through the library and through the opening in the wall, and the stairwell swallowed them, narrow, reinforced concrete, lit by temporary LEDs that his team had strung along the handrail. The air temperature dropped fast, 20 feet down, and it was cold enough to see her breath. The smell hit next, a combination of chemical solvents, filtered air, and something underneath both of those that she recognized as the particular staleness of a space that had been sealed and climate-controlled for a very long time. The first sub-basement level opened into a corridor lined with reinforced doors. Most of them stood open now, agents moving in and out with evidence bags and cameras. She passed them without stopping, taking in what she could. Servers stacked floor to ceiling in one room, dark now, removed from power. A room that had functioned as some kind of communications center, with mounting hardware still on the walls where equipment had clearly been removed in a hurry by someone who'd had advance warning. A room that was empty except for 3 heavy safes, 2 of which had been opened, one still shut. Westbrook stopped at the 4th door on the left. "In here," he said. She went in. The room was large, larger than the footprint of the corridor suggested, which meant it extended under the main structure rather than under the library. It was climate-controlled at a specific temperature she estimated at 58 degrees Fahrenheit, which was not a comfortable temperature for humans, but was a standard preservation temperature for certain pharmaceutical compounds. The shelving along 3 walls held inventory that she began reading before she'd fully crossed the threshold. Sealed containers, labeled in a proprietary coding system, organized by category and a pattern she recognized. Transport cases stacked near the interior wall, padded and sealed, the same kind used in medical logistics operations for organs and tissue. A workstation with a built-in scale and a residue pattern on the surface that told her exactly what had been measured there. She set her bag on the floor and stood in the center of the room. "Walk me through what you think this was used for," Westbrook said from the doorway. "I don't need you to walk me through it," she said. "Give me 10 minutes." She gave it 12. She moved around the perimeter of the room with her hands behind her back, not touching anything because she understood the evidentiary sensitivity of the space. And she read the inventory system, the temperature log on the climate control panel, the residue patterns, the transport case sizing relative to the labeled contents of the inventory. When she turned back to Westbrook, his expression was controlled, but she could read the tension underneath it. "This room was used for 2 separate functions," she said. "The pharmaceutical inventory along the north and east walls is consistent with a large-scale distribution staging operation. Quantities and compound types that are controlled substance range, organized for systematic movement rather than medical use. The workstation is where they process the packaging for movement. That scale residue is consistent with high-volume pharmaceutical cutting, not legitimate dosing." She paused. "The transport cases near the interior wall are a different function entirely. Those dimensions aren't for pharmaceuticals. They're sized for human transport. Specifically, the cases are consistent with the kind of insulated transport used in trafficking operations for incapacitated individuals." The words sat in the cold air. Westbrook said nothing. "The facility wasn't just a financial nerve center," Lena said. "It was also a medical operations hub. Someone with clinical training designed this room. The inventory organization, the temperature specifications, the workstation layout. This wasn't put together by criminals who bought some medical equipment. This was designed by someone who knew what they were doing." She looked at him. "Which means there are more facilities. You don't build this level of clinical infrastructure in one location. This is a staging point. The operational center is somewhere else." Westbrook was quiet for 3 full seconds. Then he said, "We have a secondary address. It came off one of the servers on the first level before the encryption kicked in. A freight facility outside a city called Silver Mesa, Nevada." He held her gaze. "We weren't sure if it was relevant until right now." Lena looked at the transport cases. She thought about the countdown alarm she'd heard before dawn, the one that had started ticking somewhere below her feet while Kaminsky was laughing at her badge. "It's relevant," she said. She looked at the temperature log on the climate control panel one more time. The log showed a gap, a period of approximately 3 hours, roughly 4 weeks ago, during which the temperature in the room had dropped below its set point before recovering. An equipment error, possibly. Or a controlled access event during which the climate system had been deliberately overridden to allow for rapid loading. 3 hours was enough time to move a significant amount of cargo. "How long to get a team to Silver Mesa?" she said. "Air transport, 90 minutes, Westbrook said. She picked up her bag from the floor. "Then we have a problem," she said, "because whatever was staged through this room 4 weeks ago is either already in transit or already at the destination." She walked toward the door. "And if I'm reading this correctly, some of what they moved wasn't pharmaceutical." She stopped in the doorway and looked back at the room one last time. The transport cases were standard green, matte finish, unmarked, the kind of anonymous industrial container that could move through any logistics system without triggering a second look. But the padding on the interior that she could see through the gap in the nearest unlatched case, the padding was soft, custom fitted. Not for cargo. She turned away and walked back toward the stairwell, and behind her Westbrook was already on his radio, and the operation that had begun as a real estate raid was becoming something much larger and much harder to contain. And somewhere 2,000 miles away in a freight facility outside Silver Mesa, Nevada, an alarm that nobody on this driveway had triggered yet was already waiting to go off. She was halfway up the stairwell when Westbrook's radio cut through the cold air with a burst of static, and then a voice, tight, controlled, the kind of voice that had been trained to deliver bad news without inflection. "Commander, we have a problem on the north side, the carriage house. Westbrook pressed the transmit button. What kind of problem? There's a vehicle that doesn't match our inventory. Came in sometime in the last 6 hours. The cameras on that side were looped. Lena stopped on the stairs. She didn't turn around. She was already processing. 6 hours meant between midnight and dawn, which meant someone had known the raid was coming with enough lead time to move something into position under the cover of the operation itself. That was a specific kind of intelligence failure, and it was worse than most people on this scene were equipped to understand yet. How many people know the target address for this raid, she said. Westbrook looked at her. That's a very short list. Then someone on your short list made a call. He didn't argue with that. He moved past her on the stairs, and she followed him up and through the library and out through the mansion's north exit into the cold morning air, where a cluster of agents had formed a loose perimeter around the carriage house. The vehicle in question was a gray cargo van with commercial plates and a magnetic company logo on the side for a refrigeration service out of Duluth. The logo was convincing at a distance. Up close, the magnetic edges were visible, and the logo had been applied slightly off-center. Lena walked around the van without being asked. The rear doors were locked. She pressed her palm flat against the cargo door and held it there for 3 seconds. It's temperature-controlled, she said, running internally, not connected to the building power. How do you know that? The engine is warm and it's not running now. It shut off recently. But the body is cool in a way that isn't ambient. It's holding a set temperature from internal refrigeration. She stepped back. Whatever's in there, they weren't planning to leave it here long. The magnetic plates, the shut-off timing, someone was supposed to come back for this. Westbrook ordered the doors opened. The agent with the breach kit worked the lock in under a minute and swung the doors wide. Inside, packed into the temperature-controlled cargo space, were 7 sealed medical transport cases, the same style as the ones in the sub-basement room, the same matte green, the same custom-fitted interior padding, and between them, 2 hard-shell containers of a type Lena identified immediately as pharmaceutical cold chain transport, the kind used for compounds that degraded rapidly outside a specific temperature window. But that wasn't what made everyone go quiet. At the back of the cargo space, tucked behind the last transport case, was a bag. A single backpack, civilian, dark blue. The kind a person carried for themselves. Westbrook had an agent. Bag and tag the transport cases without opening them and ordered the pharmaceutical containers photographed in situ before removal. The backpack was handled separately, pulled out carefully, unzipped on the gravel with an agent in gloves working through the contents. Inside, 2 phones, neither of them active. A folded set of documents in a language Lena didn't immediately recognize. A compact set of medical instruments, the kind a trained person would carry for rapid field assessment, not the kind you'd buy at a pharmacy. And at the bottom of the bag, beneath everything else, a laminated card that the agent held up in the morning light. Lena looked at it. It was an access credential. The format was unfamiliar, but the structure wasn't. She had carried something similar during her 3rd deployment. The layered encoding on the photograph, the specific placement of the serial number, the color band at the bottom margin. This wasn't a commercial forgery. This was issued by someone who knew how real credentials were built, because they had built real ones. That's not a criminal making a fake ID, she said. That's someone with access to the production method. Westbrook took the laminated card and looked at it for a long time. That narrows our problem considerably, he said quietly. And by the way he said it, flat, without the particular kind of surprise that characterized genuine shock, she understood that this wasn't entirely new information to him. He had suspected something like this. What he hadn't known was the level. How far up, she said. That's what I can't say to you right now. Westbrook. Lena. He said her name the way people did when they were trying to communicate that a conversation had reached its limit. There are things that are not mine to put in your hands yet. What I can tell you is that the Silver Mesa address is now a Tier 1 priority, and I need you on the transport to Nevada. She looked at the backpack, at the phones, dark and silent, at the folded documents that someone had thought important enough to carry personally. What language is that? She said. The agent who had unpacked the bag looked up. Preliminary. I think it's a composite. Base structure looks like a Slavic dialect, but there are words in here I don't recognize as standard vocabulary. He paused. Could be an internal code language. Some networks develop them. Some networks, Lena said, or one very specific kind of network? She didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. Westbrook's expression told her he'd arrived at the same place. They had 40 minutes before the transport was wheels up from a private airfield 12 miles south of Ravenport. Lena spent 20 of those minutes in the mobile command van reviewing what the decryption team had pulled from the Blackridge servers before the encryption protocols had locked them out. It wasn't much. Fragments of transaction records, partial routing maps, a few dozen file names that revealed their contents only by their organizational structure. But it was enough to confirm the shape of what she'd described in the sub-basement room. The Blackridge estate had functioned as a central coordination node for a network that moved multiple categories of cargo through a layered logistics system designed to look, at every visible point, like a legitimate commercial operation. The medical infrastructure she'd identified in the climate-controlled room was not incidental. It was load-bearing. Without that component, the pharmaceutical cover, the clinical legitimacy it provided, the credential infrastructure that let certain people move through medical systems unquestioned, the rest of the network would have had no way to sustain its concealment. Someone had understood that. Someone had understood it well enough to build around it, which meant someone with a specific kind of knowledge had either designed the system or advised on its design. That person wasn't Victor Rourke. Rourke was the money and the face and the public relations infrastructure. The person who had designed the medical architecture of this network had done it from the inside out. She was still thinking about that when the transport van took her to the airfield, and she was still thinking about it when the aircraft lifted off the tarmac into a pale morning sky and banked southwest toward Nevada. The flight was 93 minutes. She spent the first 20 trying to sleep, which didn't work. She spent the next 40 reviewing the Silver Mesa facility data that Westbrook's team had assembled from satellite imagery, commercial records, and the partial routing maps from the servers. The facility was a former freight and cold storage warehouse in an industrial corridor northeast of Silver Mesa's main commercial district. 9 years inactive, according to public records. Sold 18 months ago to a subsidiary of a company that traced back, if you followed it through 4 layers of corporate registration, to a holding entity connected to Rourke's transportation division. The deactivation of the public records had been clean. Utility accounts suspended, property tax current, no code violations, no complaints. From the outside, it was a closed building slowly deteriorating. The satellite imaging told a different story. Thermal imaging from a past 3 weeks ago had shown heat signatures consistent with active climate control across approximately 60% of the building's interior footprint. Something in there was being kept at a specific temperature. Lena looked at the satellite image for a long time. She thought about the transport cases in the sub-basement. She thought about the backpack in the cargo van and the people careful enough to carry their own documents in a coded language. She thought about the temperature gap in the sub-basement climate log, the 3-hour window, 4 weeks ago, when something had been moved. Her hands were not entirely steady when she set the tablet down. She noticed that. She let it be what it was without addressing it, because they were 40 minutes from Silver Mesa, and there wasn't room in the next 40 minutes for anything except what came next. Westbrook was across the aisle, on a call he'd been conducting in a low voice for the last 20 minutes. She caught fragments, authorization levels, a name she didn't recognize repeated twice, the phrase confirmed secondary. And then he ended the call and looked over at her. "We have movement at the Nevada facility," he said. "What kind?" "Thermal picked up an increase in activity in the last hour. Loading bay area." He paused. "Someone at the Blackridge site made a call before we got full communications lockdown. We don't know who yet." Lena absorbed that. "Which means they know we're coming. Which means they might be in the process of moving. Then we land and we have no time." "Correct." She looked out the window at the landscape below. Flat, pale, Nevada's high desert bleached by early autumn. "What's the tactical plan?" "We have a ground team from the Las Vegas field office that's been positioned outside the facility since this morning. They haven't moved in because we needed the authorization chain cleared, and we needed—" He stopped. "You needed someone who could identify what they found inside," she said. He nodded. "That's a long time to hold a perimeter outside a facility that might be active," she said. "It is," he agreed, "and the Las Vegas team is aware." She turned back to the window. Below, a highway cut through the pale landscape in a straight line, the kind of road that looked easy until you drove it and understood how empty easy could feel. Westbrook, she said. The design medical infrastructure at Black Ridge. The person who built that system understood clinical operations at a level that goes beyond consulting. They had operational experience. She paused. Is there anyone in your intelligence picture who fits that? He was quiet long enough that it became an answer. You can't tell me, she said. Not yet. But there's someone. He didn't confirm it. He didn't deny it. He looked at the back of the seat in front of him and said, We'll be on the ground in 30 minutes. The Silver Mesa airfield was smaller than Ravenport's private strip, which was saying something. They touched down on a single runway and were met by 2 vehicles from the Nevada field team, large, dark, already running. Lena was in the second vehicle before the aircraft engines had fully spooled down, her bag across her lap, watching the landscape slide past the tinted windows as they moved northeast toward the industrial corridor. The driver didn't introduce himself. The agent in the front passenger seat turned partway around and said, Ground team reports the loading bay activity has stopped. No visual on vehicles departing, but we don't have full sight lines on the east side of the building. What do we have on the east side? Westbrook said. A blind spot. The building has an access point there that's not on the commercial floor plan. Came up in the thermal imaging, but we didn't have eyes on it until... The agent's radio cut in. He listened. His expression changed in a way that didn't require interpretation. We have a vehicle moving, east side. It just cleared the fence line. Can the perimeter intercept? Trying to raise them now. The next 4 minutes were the controlled chaos of an operation adjusting in real time to information arriving faster than it could be processed. Lena sat in the back and listened and built the picture in her head. The vehicle on the east side, the blind spot in the perimeter, the loading bay that had gone quiet, and behind all of it, the thermal map of a building where something had been kept alive and warm for weeks, while the official record said nothing was there. The vehicle from the east side was intercepted 3 blocks from the facility by the perimeter team. It contained 2 men and a quantity of documents and hard drives that represented, based on the agent's initial field report relayed over the radio, a significant portion of the facility's operational record keeping. They hadn't gotten out, but they had tried. The building itself was breached 12 minutes after the vehicle intercept. 4 teams, coordinated entry, 3 access points simultaneously. Lena went in with Westbrook's team through the loading bay, which was large enough to drive 2 trucks through, side by side, and smelled of machine oil and something underneath it that she recognized and didn't want to name yet. The interior was a maze of partitioned spaces, some of them clearly repurposed cold storage units, some of them constructed more recently from temporary walls and portable infrastructure. The lighting in the main corridor ran off a generator that was still active, casting everything in a flat industrial yellow. Her footsteps echoed. The first partitioned space on the left was empty, but not recently empty. There were personal items on the floor, the kind of small objects that accumulate when people occupy a space over time, rather than passing through it. A shoe, small, child-sized. A folded piece of cloth with writing on it in a language she didn't recognize. A single plastic cup. She stopped. She looked at the floor of the partitioned space, at the shoe, at the writing, at the particular way the space was organized, which was not like a storage room and not like a staging area, and not like anything a freight facility should contain. She had known, intellectually, since the sub-basement in Black Ridge. She had known it in the way you know something when the evidence is unambiguous and your brain has processed it fully, but your body hasn't caught up. Standing in the partitioned space, looking at a child's shoe on a concrete floor in a freight warehouse in the Nevada desert, her body caught up. She kept moving. She had to. The third space, the fifth, the seventh. This one was larger, and it wasn't empty. The agent ahead of her had already stopped in the doorway and was on his radio, and Lena pushed past him because she needed to see, and because she was the person on this team who had the training for what came next. Inside the space, on folding cots arranged in rows, were people, some sleeping, some awake, some in a condition that Lena assessed in the first 10 seconds as requiring immediate medical intervention. The air in the space was stale but warm. The climate control had been running even as the facility's operators tried to evacuate their records. Someone had at least maintained the basic conditions. She counted as she moved. 14 in this room. She called it back to the doorway agent, who relayed it, and she heard the number travel up the radio chain and the quality of the silence that followed it. She was working, assessing, prioritizing, calling for the field medical team that Westbrook had staged outside, when she heard his voice at the doorway behind her. "There are more," he said. "We're finding more in the east section." She didn't stop working. "How many more?" "We don't have a full count yet." His voice was careful in a way that told her the number was going to be significant. "Lena, I'm working, Westbrook. I know. I need you to know." He stopped. Started again. "The documents from the intercepted vehicle, the hard drives. Our analyst on site just pulled the first layer of the encryption. There's a name on the primary operational account for this facility." She was checking a woman's blood pressure with 2 fingers on her wrist, counting in her head, and she didn't look up. "Tell me." "It's not Rourke," Westbrook said. She looked up. I was standing in the doorway with his radio in one hand and his other hand flat against the doorframe, and his expression was the expression of someone who has reached the point in an operation where the thing they feared most has been confirmed. "The primary operational account," he said, "is registered under the name of the Chief Medical Officer of Halverson Medical Center." The blood pressure she had been measuring jumped under her fingers, not the patient's. Her own pulse, a single hard beat. "Darren Coyle," she said. The name sat between them in the stale air of the warehouse, and outside the radius of her immediate work, she could hear the sounds of the operation expanding. More teams, more radio traffic, the systematic process of a large facility being documented and cleared. And somewhere in that expanding radius, she thought, Coyle was sitting in his office in Ravenport making morning rounds and believing that the call he had made an hour ago, the call that had gotten one vehicle out through the east side blind spot before the perimeter tightened, had been enough. He had no idea what was on those hard drives. He had no idea that the vehicle had been intercepted 3 blocks from the building. He had no idea that the woman he had fired by phone at 5 in the morning was standing in his facility right now, 2,000 miles away, counting the people he had helped put there. She had 12 people who needed immediate evacuation to medical facilities, 4 who could wait 40 minutes without that wait becoming a decision she'd regret, and 2 who were in a state that required her to make choices with inadequate equipment on a concrete floor in a freight warehouse, while the operation around her continued to expand and Westbrook's voice filtered in from the doorway, giving her information she filed and didn't respond to because she didn't have the bandwidth. The field medical team arrived 8 minutes after she called for them. 2 paramedics from the Las Vegas unit, adequately trained, not specialized. She redirected them to the lower priority cases and kept the critical ones for herself, which was not a policy decision, it was a triage decision, and there was a difference. The woman whose blood pressure had been irregular was stabilizing. The older man in the third cot was the problem. His breathing pattern was wrong in a specific way that told her his oxygen exchange was compromised, probably from extended exposure to the recycled air in an enclosed space with inadequate ventilation, possibly compounded by something she didn't have enough information to name yet. She positioned him on his side, cleared his airway, and did what she could with what she had, which was not enough but was more than nothing, and sometimes that was the entire margin. Outside the partitioned room, the count kept climbing. She heard it in fragments over the next 40 minutes. Numbers called over radios, confirmed and updated, the systematic accounting of a space that had been full of people that nobody on the outside had known were there. 31 in the east section, 22 in a second partitioned area beyond the loading bay, 19 in a space that had originally been a refrigeration unit, climate-controlled and sealed, with one small ventilation grate that was the only connection to outside air. By the time the field teams had cleared the entire building, the number stood at 129. 129 people in a freight warehouse that didn't officially exist. Lena sat on the edge of the third cot after the older man had been transferred to a gurney and was being moved toward the ambulances staged outside, and she looked at her hands. They were shaking slightly, not from fear, or not only from fear, but from the accumulated physical demand of the last several hours and the specific kind of exhaustion that came from doing high-precision work in conditions that weren't designed for it. Her knees ached from the concrete floor. She had a cut on her left palm that she hadn't noticed acquiring and couldn't identify the source of. The cut wasn't serious. She pressed her thumb against it briefly and then stopped, because pressing it didn't help, and the sting was at least useful as something concrete to feel. Westbrook came to find her there. He didn't say anything for a moment. He stood in the doorway of the now empty room and looked at the cots, The folded cloth with writing on it, the small shoe that evidence teams had photographed and tagged and left in place for now. "How are you doing?" he said. It was such a straightforward question that she almost didn't know what to do with it. "I need coffee in about 9 hours," she said, "neither of which is happening right now." "No," he agreed. He came into the room and sat on the cot across from her, which she appreciated. Standing over someone while they sat was a specific kind of power positioning, and he either knew that or instinctively avoided it, and either way she was grateful. The analyst has the second layer of the encryption. There are financial records going back 4 years, transaction logs, payment schedules, operational budgets. Coyle's name appears on 53 separate authorizations. He wasn't just providing cover, she said. No, he was an active operational participant. The medical credential infrastructure, the falsified employment records, the pharmaceutical procurement bypass system, the clinical documentation that made the network's movement look like legitimate medical logistics. Coyle designed most of it. Westbrook paused. He's been doing it for 4 years and 4 months. She thought about the plaque in the Halverson Medical Lobby. The photograph of Rourke and Coyle at the pediatric wing dedication, both of them smiling. The kind of smile that said, "This is a good day. This is the kind of people we are." She had walked past that photograph hundreds of times. "Has he been picked up?" she said. "Warrant is being executed right now. Ravenport Field Team." He looked at her. "He was at the hospital when they arrived. Morning rounds." She nodded. She didn't feel what she had expected to feel about that. Not satisfaction, not relief. Something more complicated. Something that had to do with the fact that she had worked under Coyle for 2 years, had trusted his judgment on difficult cases, had occasionally disagreed with him, and occasionally been wrong and occasionally been right, and none of that history fit cleanly into the category of what he turned out to be. The nurses he fired, she said, the staff he turned over in the last 2 years, was that we think at least some of it was deliberate. People who asked questions he didn't want asked. People who noticed irregularities in the pharmaceutical inventory and reported them through the wrong channels. His channels. Westbrook's voice was level, but something underneath it wasn't. That's going to take time to fully document. But people lost jobs. Yes. She pressed her thumb against the cut on her palm again. What happens now? Right now, you get some water and you eat something from whatever the field team has in their cooler because you haven't eaten since before 5 in the morning and it's almost noon. He said it matter-of-factly, not as a suggestion. After that, I need you to walk the facility with our forensic medical analyst and help him interpret the clinical infrastructure, the pharmaceutical inventory, the medical record system, the procurement logs. He's good, but you're going to read it faster. And after that, you get on a plane back to Minnesota, and you start the process of giving a formal statement. He paused. And you're going to need a lawyer before you do that. Not because you're in trouble, you're not. But because the people who are in trouble have lawyers, and those lawyers are going to look for any procedural gap they can find. Your statement needs to be clean. She understood that. She had understood it before he said it. There's something else, she said. It wasn't a question. There's something else, he confirmed. He looked at the doorway, then back at her. The credential in the backpack, the one from the cargo van at Black Ridge. Our document team has confirmed it's real, meaning it was produced by a legitimate credential-issuing authority. The question is which one and how. He leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees. We traced the production method to a federal medical licensing body. Someone inside that body either produced the credential directly or provided the technical specifications for its production. The room was quiet except for the distant radio traffic and the sound of vehicles outside. How deep does this go, she said. Deep enough that this operation is not going to end with Rourke and Coyle. He said it without drama, which made it worse. What we found today is a significant node, but the network has other nodes, and some of those nodes have connections that are going to create complications at levels above what this task force was originally authorized to address. Which is why you've been looking for me for 11 months, she said. He nodded slowly. You didn't find me through the task force records, she said. My service records are classified. The 14th unit doesn't exist in any public index. No, he agreed. Then who flagged me? He was quiet for 2 seconds. Not the considering kind of quiet, the having already decided kind. The embedded agent at Black Ridge, he said. The one in the gray jacket. His name is Reeves. He served in a parallel unit to yours, not the 14th, but an adjacent operation with overlapping training protocols. He encountered your work during a joint assessment in the third year of his embedding. He flagged you to the task force 8 months ago as a potential asset if the operation reached the point where medical intelligence expertise was needed at the operational level. He flagged me before he knew the operation would reach that point, she said. He was optimistic about the timeline. She almost laughed. She didn't, but it was close. She stood up. Her knees protested in the way knees did when they'd been treated worse than was reasonable for an extended period. She picked up her bag and looked at the room one more time. The cots, the small shoe, the specific quality of a space that had held people who had no choice about being there. "Where's the forensic medical analyst?" she said. The facility walk took 2 hours and 40 minutes, and it was the most clinically disturbing 2 hours and 40 minutes Lena had spent since her third deployment. The forensic analyst, a man named Pruitt, who was methodical and quiet and had a habit of writing things in a small notebook, rather than using his tablet, which she found unexpectedly reassuring, moved through the space beside her and asked precise questions and listened to the answers without interrupting. She talked him through the pharmaceutical inventory system, which was sophisticated enough to have sustained federal scrutiny under normal circumstances and had only a few internal inconsistencies that required trained eyes to identify. She walked him through the medical record architecture, the parallel documentation system that created a legitimate-looking paper trail for every controlled substance that passed through the facility, each record linked to a real patient name in a real medical system, except that the patients were phantoms, names pulled from dormant records and systems that had inadequate cross-referencing protocols. "Coyle built this," Pruitt said at one point. Not a question. The architecture, yes. Some of the implementation was probably done by someone with less training. Following his specifications, she looked at a row of inventory logs. See the variance in the notation style between these two sections? One person was meticulous about units of measure. The other one used abbreviations that aren't standard. They're internally consistent, but they're not clinical convention. Two different people maintaining the same system with different levels of clinical background. Pruitt wrote something in his notebook. "Can you identify which sections Coyle handled directly?" he said. "Probably, given enough time with the full record set." She looked at him. "How long before this goes to prosecutors?" "Faster than you'd think," he said. "The financial records from the hard drives are clean, meaning they're legible, not encrypted. That's unusual. Most operations this size have multiple layers of financial obfuscation. The fact that these records are relatively clear suggests either that whoever maintained them felt secure enough not to bother, or they wanted an exit option," she said. He looked at her. "If the financial records are legible and detailed and linked directly to specific names and authorizations," she said, "then someone who had access to those records had the ability, at any moment, to hand them to a prosecutor and buy themselves a significant amount of consideration." She paused. "Coyle designed the credential system, but he didn't design the financial system. Those are two different skill sets. Who maintained the financial records?" Pruitt was quiet. "Pruitt. That's still being worked," he said. "Is it being worked in a direction I should know about?" He looked at his notebook. "I'm not the person who can answer that." She let it go. "For now." They finished the walk at 2:40 p.m. local time. Outside, the industrial corridor had taken on the flat, bright quality of Nevada midday, heat rising off the asphalt in slow waves that made the perimeter vehicles at the far end of the block look slightly unreal. The ambulances had long since departed with the people who needed immediate care. The scene was in documentation phase now, the slower, methodical work of building an evidentiary record that would hold up in proceedings that were months or years away. Westbrook was at the command vehicle when she came out, on a call that he ended when he saw her. "We have a problem," he said. He'd said that 3 times in the last 8 hours, and each time it had been a different and progressively more significant problem, so she gave the phrase the attention it deserved. "Rourke," he said. "He was at the Black Ridge estate when the raid started. Wait. We confirmed that. He was still on the property when the federal perimeter was established. But when the teams cleared the main building, he wasn't there." She stared at him. "He was on the property," she said. "Yes." "With a full federal perimeter?" "Yes." "How is he not in custody?" Westbrook's expression was controlled in a way that communicated how controlled he was being. The perimeter had a staging gap during the arrival of our unit, approximately 4 minutes when the transition between local law enforcement perimeter management and federal assumption of the outer boundary created an unmanned sector on the southwest quadrant. Someone knew about that gap. The credential in the backpack, the looped cameras on the north side, the vehicle that had come in during the night, the call that had gotten the east side van moving before the perimeter fully tightened around the Nevada facility. The same pattern, the same intelligence. "He had someone inside your operation," she said. "We believe so." "Not Coyle. Coyle was in Ravenport." "Not Coyle." She looked at him steadily. "The short list. The people who knew the raid target." "Yes." "Westbrook, if someone on your operational team is feeding Rourke, and Rourke is now outside the perimeter with a vehicle and a head start. We have a BOLO active. Every exit route from the region is being monitored. His financial assets were frozen at 7:42 this morning and his passport flagged at the federal level." Westbrook said it like a person reciting containment measures they needed to believe in. "He doesn't have easy options. He's been running a network sophisticated enough to evade 3 federal agencies for 6 years," she said. "Easy options aren't the category to worry about." He didn't disagree. She thought. She thought about the routing maps she'd seen on the server fragments, the convoy route logic, the way it was designed for systematic movement, the layers of alternate pathways built into every major transit corridor. She thought about what she'd identified as the control room function of the Blackridge estate. Not headquarters, control room. The distinction mattered. A control room managed routes and timing and contingencies. The people who ran control rooms knew the contingencies intimately because they had designed them. "The tunnel system under the estate," she said. "Was it fully mapped?" Westbrook's expression shifted. "The teams found the primary passage and the sub-basement levels. There's a secondary tunnel that leads to the north edge of the property. They followed it to an egress point in the tree line. Egress was open." "Was there anything at the egress point?" "Disturbed ground. Recent vehicle traffic." She thought about the convoy route she'd mapped in her head from the drive up the private road. The specific design of it. The way the secondary access track branched from the main approach at a point that would be invisible from the main estate cameras. She had cataloged it at 5:04 a.m. as a detail and moved on, because at 5:04 a.m. she had been trying to find an injured person, not map an escape infrastructure. "Pull up the aerial of the Blackridge property," she said. Westbrook handed her his tablet. The aerial was already loaded, the imaging from the raid documentation. She expanded the southwest quadrant, found the tree line, and traced the terrain. "There," she said. She pointed to a feature in the terrain imaging, a break in the tree cover approximately 200 meters north of the estate's boundary, where a service road that didn't appear on public maps ran west toward the county route. "That service road exists. I saw it on approach. It connects to Route 9 at a point 2 miles below the estate's main access turn." Westbrook took the tablet and looked. If he exited through the tunnel and came out in the tree line, he had a vehicle staged on that service road, she said. And from Route 9, he had access to the county highway system before your perimeter teams had rotated to the outer boundary. Westbrook was already on his radio, relaying to the Minnesota Field Coordination. She heard the information travel and heard the adjustment going out to units that were currently positioned for a perimeter they'd built around a man who was already outside it. The next hour was a particular kind of difficult. The difficult of having identified the problem too late and watching the response machinery move at its institutional pace while the person it was pursuing moved at his own. Lena sat in the back of the command vehicle, out of the way, and reviewed everything she knew about the network's structure and tried to identify what Rourke's options actually were. His financial assets were frozen. His passport was flagged. His public properties and known associates were under surveillance. He had been inside an operation complex enough to run for 6 years, which meant he had contingency infrastructure, alternate identities, staged resources, contacts in places that didn't trace back to him cleanly. But contingency infrastructure took time to activate, and activation left traces, and he was doing all of this while being actively hunted by multiple federal agencies in real time. He would go somewhere he trusted, somewhere that wasn't in the network's primary record, somewhere that had been kept off the books precisely because it was the option you used when everything else was burned. Every operator Lena had ever known, in the military context, had that one place. The place you didn't tell anyone about, the place you'd prepared in the margins, the place that existed in your head and nowhere else, because if it existed anywhere else, it wasn't safe anymore. She was still working through that logic when Pruitt appeared at the vehicle door. "We found something," he said. She got out. He took her back into the facility, past the main documented spaces, into a section in the far northeast corner that she hadn't fully walked during the analysis. A part of the building that had been used for the actual freight operations before the facility's conversion and still had the skeletal infrastructure of its original purpose: conveyor mounting points on the ceiling, floor drains, loading hooks. In the corner of this space, behind a collapsed section of metal shelving that had been moved and then positioned back to was a second door. Heavy, reinforced, the same construction logic as the doors in the Black Ridge sub-basement. It had been locked from the outside. The breach team had opened it. Inside was a room the size of a large office. The room contained a desk, a chair, a bank of communications equipment that was significantly more sophisticated than anything else in the facility, and a filing system that was physical, paper, in labeled folders, in a locked cabinet that had been forced. The cabinet was empty. The desk surface was clean except for the marks where equipment had sat and been removed. The communications bank was dark, powered down, or damaged. She couldn't tell which from the doorway. But on the floor beside the desk, partially beneath it, was a single folder that had been missed in whatever hurried clearance operation had emptied the cabinet. It had slid under the desk, a small gap between the desk's lower drawer housing and the floor, maybe 1.5 inches, enough for a thin folder to slip through when someone was moving fast and counting on the folder being picked up with everything else. Pruitt crouched and retrieved it with gloved hands. He opened it on the desk surface. Inside were 11 pages of printed documents. The first page was a routing map, not the commercial logistics routes she had seen in the Black Ridge server fragments, but something different, more granular. A map of a specific kind of movement across a very specific geography, with timing notations in the same shorthand she had seen in the sub-basement climate logs. The second page was a financial schedule, transfers, amounts, dates, covering an 18-month period. The third was a contact list, not names, designations, alphanumeric codes, each one followed by a location notation and a method notation. She looked at the contact list for a long time. "The designations," she said. "Do you have the coding key from the Black Ridge records?" "My analyst does," Pruitt said. He was already on his phone. She looked at the routing map while she waited. The geography of it was not Nevada and not Minnesota. It was a third region entirely, and the routing passed through a transit hub she recognized. The timing notation suggested movement in windows aligned with specific operational schedules that she could identify because she had spent her years of service learning exactly the kind of schedules that criminal networks exploited. Her analyst came back with the key in 4 minutes. Pruitt compared the designations on the contact list to the key. He was quiet for a long time. She watched his face and read what was happening in it before he said anything. "The 8th designation on this list," he said. He pointed. "According to the Black Ridge coding system, this designation corresponds to a law enforcement embedded contact, someone inside a federal monitoring structure." He looked at her. "This is the list Rourke actually used, not the operational roster, the control roster, the people he relied on to know what was coming." She looked at the 8th designation. The location notation beside it read, RTF-MW, Regional Task Force, Midwest. Westbrook's task force had a Midwest regional component. "Cross-reference the designation against your personnel index," she said. Her voice was steady. She was not feeling steady, but her voice was. Pruitt looked at her. "Can you access the personnel index?" she said. "I can access part of it, not full clearance." "What can you access?" "Current assignment rosters for the field components." He worked his phone with his thumb. She watched. He stopped. He looked at the phone, and then he looked at her. "Tell me," she said. "The designation cross-references to a field position," he said. "A position that is currently listed as active at the Black Ridge estate operation." He set the phone face down on the desk slowly, with the careful deliberateness of someone who understood the weight of what they were handling. "The position is a mid-level coordination role, someone who would have had access to the raid timeline, the perimeter plan, and the transition schedule between local law enforcement and federal perimeter management. The 4-minute gap. The unmanned sector. The vehicle staged in the tree line. Name, she said. I can't pull a name with my access level. Westbrook can. Yes. Is he going to like what he finds? Pruitt was quiet for a moment that told her everything she needed to know about how the next hour was going to go. The person in this position, he said carefully, has been running coordination for this task force for 14 months. 14 months. The same amount of time that Reeves, the embedded agent in the gray jacket, had been inside Rourke's operation. She looked at the routing map, at the timing notations, at the carefully organized evidence of someone who had been watching both sides of this operation simultaneously and feeding information in the direction that kept the network alive. Reeves had flagged her to the task force 8 months ago. Reeves was the one who had confirmed her identity to Westbrook on the Black Ridge driveway this morning. Reeves was the reason she was here, in this facility, in this room, holding this folder. She thought about the gray jacket, the expression on his face when she'd stabilized the injured agent. Not recognition, she'd thought. Confirmation. She had read it as confirmation that she was the person he'd flagged. She picked up the folder. "Where's Reeves right now?" she said. Pruitt looked at her with an expression that had gone very still. "He was at the Black Ridge estate," he said. "He was part of the initial entry team." "Is he still there?" Pruitt picked up his phone and made a call. He spoke for 40 seconds. He listened. His face did not change. He lowered the phone. "He was logged out of the Black Ridge site," he said, 47 minutes after you left for the airfield." She held the folder in both hands and looked at the routing map and thought about the vehicle in the tree line and the 4-minute gap in the perimeter and the backpack in the cargo van with the credential that had been produced by someone with access to federal production methods. And she thought about the contact list and the 8th designation and Reeves in the gray jacket, watching her work on the injured agent with the expression she had misread completely. And somewhere in all of that, a thought she hadn't fully formed yet began to sharpen into something she could almost see. Reeves hadn't flagged her to the task force 8 months ago because she was an asset. He had flagged her because she was a threat. And the best way to manage a threat was to know exactly where it was at all times. She had been brought to Black Ridge and then to Silver Mesa, not because the task force needed her expertise. She had been brought here because someone needed to know where she was when the evacuation happened. Her phone buzzed in her jacket pocket. She pulled it out. The number on the screen was a Minnesota area code she didn't recognize. She stared at it for 3 full seconds. She answered. The voice on the other end was male, calm, and entirely without the quality of someone who was running or afraid. "Captain Vance," the voice said. Not Sorrel. Her military designation, which was not in any civilian record. "You have the wrong number," she said. "I don't think so," the voice said. "I think you're standing in a room with a folder that has a routing map in it, and I think you're starting to understand something that I'd prefer you understood correctly. So before you take that folder to Westbrook, who is a good man and will act on what you give him, which is the problem, I'd like to tell you what's actually in it." Her hand tightened on the folder. "Who is this?" she said. A pause. And then, "Someone who's been inside this operation longer than Reeves, longer than Coyle, longer than anyone on your current list, and someone who has documentation that will either end this network completely or disappear, depending on what you do in the next 10 minutes. Pruitt was looking at her. She turned slightly away from him, not rudely, just enough to take the call outside his direct line of sight, and kept her voice low and flat. 10 minutes is not a negotiating window, she said. 10 minutes is a pressure tactic. "You're right," the voice said. "So let me skip the pressure and tell you what's true. The routing map in that folder shows movement through a transit hub in Bozeman, Montana. The timing notations correspond to a federal cargo inspection schedule. Specifically, the windows when federal oversight at that hub drops to minimum staffing. Those windows were provided to Rourke's network by someone inside the Transportation Security Oversight structure. That someone is not on any list you currently have." She said nothing. "The financial schedule on page 2 covers 18 months of payments," the voice continued. "The recipients are coded, but the coding key in the Black Ridge records will only decrypt 11 of the 14 designations. The other 3 require a secondary key that was never stored at Black Ridge. It was stored somewhere else. I have it." "Why are you telling me this?" Because Reeves is going to try to recover that folder before it reaches your chain of command. And when he does, he's going to encounter a problem he hasn't anticipated. A pause. That problem is you, but only if you know what you're holding. She looked at the folder in her hand, at the routing map visible through the translucent cover sheet. She thought about Reeves, logged out of the Blackridge site 47 minutes after she had boarded the transport. Time enough to reach the airfield. Time enough to board another flight to Nevada on a different manifest. "Where are you?" she said. "Closer than you'd prefer," the voice said. "Give the folder to Westbrook. All of it. Right now, before Reeves gets to the site. Tell Westbrook that the 3 encrypted designations require a secondary key and that someone with that key made contact. He'll know what to do with that. And then? And then you let me handle the part of this that I've been positioned to handle for 3 years. You've been inside this network for 3 years, she said, building a case that the task force alone doesn't have the authority to prosecute. Because the people at the top of the financial structure are not criminal associates of Rourke. They are people who regulate the systems that would normally investigate them. The voice paused. Give Westbrook the folder. Now. The call ended. She stood with the phone in her hand for approximately 4 seconds, which was as long as she could afford, and then she looked at Pruitt. Get Westbrook, she said. Right now. Pruitt moved. She stood in the room and looked at the communications bank and thought about the call and ran it against everything she knew, which was the only reliable tool she had. The caller had known her military designation. They had known the content of the folder without having seen it. They had known about Reeves's timeline in a way that suggested access to the same operational picture she was looking at, but from a different angle. 3 years inside the network. That was longer than the task force had been active, longer than Reeves had been embedded, longer than the operation had been an official federal priority. Someone had been building a case before anyone official had started looking. Westbrook came through the door at a controlled walk that was almost a run. He read her face before she spoke. Talk to me, he said. She handed him the folder and talked. She gave it to him in sequence. The routing map, the financial schedule, the contact list, the 8th designation, the cross-reference to the task force personnel index, Reeves's departure time from Blackridge, and then the call. She gave it to him straight, without editorializing, because he needed the information and not her interpretation of it until he asked. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he stood with the folder open to the contact list and looked at the 8th designation for a long moment. The secondary key, he said. Yes. The caller, voice profile, anything distinctive? Male. Controlled. No regional accent I could identify. Mid-range pitch. He knew my military designation, which means he either has access to classified service records or he's been briefed by someone who does. Westbrook looked at Pruitt. Get the site commander. I need a full personnel location check for everyone currently logged to this operation, starting with anyone who departed the Blackridge scene in the last 2 hours. He looked back at Lena. The 8 designation. If it cross-references where I think it does, it points inside your operation. Yes. He said it without flinching. She respected that. Which means my communications from this point forward need to go through a channel that is not the standard task force infrastructure. You have one? I have one, he said. I built it in the 3rd month of this operation because I had a feeling I might need it. I haven't used it yet. He closed the folder. I'm going to use it now. She stepped back and let him work. He moved to the far side of the room and made calls on a phone she hadn't seen him use before. Compact, different from the tactical unit he'd been carrying all morning. She watched him from a distance and listened to what she could hear, which wasn't much, and thought about the caller's instruction to let him handle the part he'd been positioned to handle. 3 years. Someone had been inside this network for 3 years without the task force knowing. That wasn't an accident, and it wasn't a solo operation. That required support infrastructure, resource access, and protection from above the task force's authority level, which meant the caller was either working for an agency that the task force had no visibility into or working for an authority that superseded the task force entirely. Either possibility was going to make the next phase of this significantly more complicated. Westbrook came back 17 minutes later. In those 17 minutes, the quality of activity around the facility had changed. She could see it through the room's single high window, the shift in how people moved outside, the additional vehicles that had arrived without announcement. Reeves landed at Las Vegas McCarran 40 minutes ago, Westbrook said. Private charter? Different name on the manifest, but biometrics matched on arrival. He's in transit toward the Silver Mesa corridor. How far? 22 minutes, maybe less. He's not coming alone. Who's with him? Two people we haven't fully identified yet. They came off the same charter. Westbrook looked at her with an expression that was tired in a way that went past the physical. The 8th designation. I ran it through the channel I told you about. The cross-reference came back to a name. He paused. His name is Aldrich Fine. He's been the task force's interagency liaison for the Midwest regional component for 14 months. He has access to every operational timeline we've run, every perimeter plan, every personnel assignment. Aldrich Fine. She didn't know the name, but the position description told her everything. Interagency liaison was the kind of role that existed in the spaces between agencies, accountable to the structure in theory and in practice, accountable to whoever occupied the role and managed its paperwork. It was the perfect position for someone who needed to watch an operation without appearing to control it. Where is Fane right now? She said. That's the problem. Westbrook set the folder on the desk. He's listed as in transit between Ravenport and the Twin Cities field office, but his vehicle tracker went offline 40 minutes ago. Maintenance issue, according to the log. 40 minutes ago, she said. Right around the time I got the call. Yes. She looked at the communications bank on the desk. Dark, powered down, or damaged. She'd assumed damaged, because the rest of the room had been actively used until recently. But if the room had been Fane's operational point of contact with the network, and Fine had known the facility was being raided. Has anyone checked whether that equipment was powered down from the outside? She said. Westbrook followed her gaze. He called the tech analyst in. The tech analyst, young, quick, the kind of competent that didn't need to announce itself, looked at the communications bank for 90 seconds and then said, Remote shutdown. Someone killed it from an external access point about 2 hours before the facility was breached. He looked up. Whoever did it had the admin credentials for the system. Which means they had access before the raid, Westbrook said. Yes, sir, significantly before. Those credentials take time to set up. She looked at the routing map, still visible on the desk in the open folder. Bozeman, Montana. The transit hub. The inspection window schedule that had been provided by someone inside Federal Transportation Security Oversight. 3 designations that the Blackridge key couldn't decrypt. And somewhere in the 22 minutes between now and Reeves' arrival, a decision about what to do next. The caller said Reeves is going to encounter a problem he hasn't anticipated, she said. He said the problem was me. She looked at Westbrook. He knew Reeves was coming here, which means the caller knows where Reeves is. And if the caller has been inside this network for 3 years and has a secondary key that unlocks the 3 remaining designations, then the caller has been watching Reeves operate for at least part of that time, Westbrook said. Which means whatever Reeves is coming here to do, the caller is expecting it. She paused. He's using us, not as assets, as the mechanism. He told me to give you the folder because giving you the folder triggers the response. You lock down the site, you run the personnel checks, you create the kind of official movement that forces Reeves to improvise. She looked at the door. And when Reeves improvises, he makes something visible that wasn't visible before. Westbrook was quiet for a moment. You think the caller is running a controlled exposure, he said. I think the caller has been building toward an exposure that requires official federal action to complete, and he's been waiting for a moment when the evidence was dense enough and the witness chain was clean enough that the network couldn't suppress it. She picked up the folder. I think today is that moment, and we are that chain. And Reeves walking into this site either confirms the 8th designation in a way that official investigation alone couldn't, or it gives us something on Fane directly, or both. She held the folder. The caller's been patient for 3 years. He's not going to waste the endgame. Westbrook looked at her for a long moment. You're either right about all of that, he said, or this entire analysis is exactly what the caller wanted you to construct so that you'd stay in position and wait. Yes, she said, both things are possible. So what do we do? She thought about it for 3 seconds. We don't wait, she said. We act on the evidence we have, and we document everything that happens from this point forward with a chain of custody that doesn't go through any channel Fane has touched. Whatever the caller's game is, if the folder is real and the designations are real, and the secondary key exists, then the evidence exists. And evidence that exists can be prosecuted regardless of who brought it into the room. Westbrook picked up his secondary phone. The next 40 minutes were the kind of organized, controlled response that Lena had been trained for and had not done in civilian clothes on a Nevada industrial site, with a cut on her palm and 18 hours of inadequate sleep behind her. Westbrook locked the site. Full perimeter, no departures without his direct authorization, all communication through his secondary channel. He pulled Pruitt into the documentation chain and had the folder's contents photographed in triplicate with time-stamped metadata before the originals were bagged for transport. He initiated personnel verification checks on every member of the operation currently within the site boundary. And he had Lena placed at the interior command position, which was the room they were standing in, with two agents she had not met before, larger than the field agents, quieter, with the specific stillness of people whose primary function was to ensure that a specific person remained alive, stationed at the door. "You're not under guard," Westbrook said. "I know what I am," she said. "You're the primary witness," he said, "and the primary interpreter of the evidence. Those two things together make you a target if Reeves' objective is documentation suppression rather than asset recovery." She sat at the desk in the room that Fain had used as his contact point, and she looked at the empty filing cabinet and the clean desk surface, and thought about what it meant that Fain had been the one maintaining this space, this particular room, inside a facility he was supposed to be helping to investigate from the outside. She thought about the parallel documentation, the legitimate-looking paper trail Coyle had built into the medical record system, the financial records that were surprisingly legible, the routing map that had been left in a folder that slid under a desk in a way that could have been an accident or could have been deliberate. The caller had said the three encrypted designations required the secondary key. He had not said what the three designations were. He had only said that the people at the top of the financial structure were not criminal associates of Rourke. They were people who regulated the systems that would normally investigate them. She looked at the financial schedule on page 2 of the folder, sitting in its evidence bag on the desk. 18 months of payments, 11 decryptable designations, 3 that required a key she didn't have. She looked at the structure of the payment schedule, the amounts, the intervals, the routing notations. The 11 decryptable designations received irregular payments, variable amounts, variable timing, the payment pattern of operational expenses, of people being paid for specific tasks. The 3 encrypted designations received fixed payments, same amount, same interval, every 30 days for the full 18 months. You didn't pay operational people on a fixed monthly schedule. You paid them for tasks. Fixed monthly payments were the structure of retainers, of people whose function was not to do specific tasks, but to maintain a specific condition, an access condition, a protection condition. 3 people, each receiving a fixed monthly retainer from Rourke's network for 18 months. 3 people whose identities required a secondary key that had never been stored at any of the network's known facilities. 3 people important enough that Rourke had kept their identities in a system entirely separate from his operational infrastructure. She was still looking at the payment schedule when the first of the perimeter alerts came through. A radio burst from the external team, terse and immediate. Reeves's vehicle had been identified on the approach road. He was 4 minutes out. She heard Westbrook respond and heard the site response machinery engage, and she stayed where she was because she'd been placed where she'd been placed for a reason, and she understood the reason, and because she was watching the payment schedule and thinking about something that hadn't fully formed yet but was forming. Reeves came in fast. She heard it before she saw it. The quality of sound from outside shifting, voices sharpening, a vehicle that didn't slow at the perimeter, and then the sound of 2 vehicles and not one, and Westbrook's voice on the radio with a specific command that she recognized from her service as the command given when a situation transitions from anticipated to active. The 2 agents at the door moved to positions that placed them between her and the entrance. She stood up. 4 minutes of controlled chaos is a long time if you're inside it, and a short time if you're watching it resolve from a room with a high window. She couldn't see most of it. She heard it, the verbal exchanges, the escalating volume, one moment of physical sound that was ambiguous enough to mean several things and resolved eventually into meaning that someone had gone down without a firearm being discharged. She heard Westbrook's voice twice, controlled and hard, giving commands that were complied with. Then it went quiet. The agent at the door listened to his earpiece and said, "Reeves is in custody. His two companions are detained. Nobody's been hurt." She let out a breath that she had not been aware of holding. "And fine?" she said. The agent listened again. His expression did something complicated. "Fine was in one of the two vehicles," he said. "He came with Reeves." She sat back down at the desk. Fane had been in transit between Ravenport and the Twin Cities. That had been his last logged position. He'd either never made the trip or he'd diverted, and he'd diverted toward Nevada, toward the facility, toward the folder, and the evidence chain, and the woman sitting in the contact room with two agents at her door. When Westbrook came back, he was carrying his tactical radio in one hand and the secondary phone in the other, and he looked like a man who had just run 2 miles but was not going to admit it. "Fine had a drive," he said. He set the tactical radio on the desk. "External storage. He got rid of it before we could secure it. Threw it when the situation went active. We have agents walking the area outside. We'll find it." "He knew what would be on it if we found it on his person," she said. "He knew exactly what would be on it." Westbrook sat in the chair across the desk. It was the first time she had seen him sit in hours. The two people with him were running ID now, but preliminary reads suggest they're not law enforcement. They're private, which means somebody was paying them, and that payment trail is going to lead somewhere. "The 3 encrypted designations pay on a fixed monthly retainer," she said. Westbrook looked at her. She told him what she'd seen in the payment schedule, the difference between the irregular operational payments and the fixed monthly retainers. He listened, and then he looked at the evidence bag containing the financial schedule with the expression of a man recalibrating. 3 people maintaining a protection condition," he said, "for 18 months, through the network's most active expansion period." She paused. "Whoever those 3 are, they're not Rourke's accomplices. They're his insurance. As long as they were in position, the network couldn't be prosecuted from the inside because the systems designed to investigate it were being maintained in a condition favorable to it." Westbrook was quiet for a long time. Outside, she could hear the systematic activity of agents searching the ground for a discarded drive. "The caller," he said. "The secondary key. If he has it, he has the 3 names," she said. "And he's been sitting on them for how long?" "Long enough to build a case that can't be suppressed," she said. "Long enough that even if 2 of the 3 names belong to people with the institutional authority to make an investigation disappear, the third one can't." Westbrook looked at his secondary phone. "He's going to call again," she said. "Yes." "When he does, don't negotiate. He's been waiting 3 years. He's going to deliver." She looked at the evidence bag. "He just needed us to be here first, officially, on record, with a chain of custody that starts before he walks in." Westbrook nodded slowly. The phone in her jacket buzzed. She looked at the screen. The same Minnesota number. She showed it to Westbrook and he nodded, and she answered and put it on speaker so he could hear. "The drive Fane discarded," the caller said without preamble. "It's 11 meters east-northeast of the facility's primary loading bay door, partial burial in loose gravel. He didn't have time to do it properly." A pause. "On the drive you'll find the secondary key, a complete decrypted version of the 3 retainer designations and 4 years of communications records between those 3 individuals and Rourke's financial coordinating entity." Another pause. "You'll also find a file with my documentation of Reeves' 18 months of operational access to the task force, with specific instances of each intelligence compromise and the corresponding network action that followed each one. It's time-stamped and sourced." "Who are you?" Westbrook said. A silence. Not the silence of someone deciding whether to answer, the silence of someone deciding how. "My name is Carver Doyle," the voice said. "I'm a former special agent with the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. I was terminated 4 years ago after I began building a case that touched the second of the 3 retainer designations." A pause. "The termination was not a disciplinary action. It was a removal. I've been building the case privately since then." "Why not bring it to another agency?" Westbrook said. "I brought it to 2. The first one referred it to a review process that was overseen by the 3rd retainer designation. The second one, I didn't get past the initial intake because the intake coordinator was Fane." A pause. "After that, I decided the case needed to be complete before it was submitted anywhere. Complete enough that no single person with institutional authority could close a door in front of it." "And now?" Westbrook said. Now you have a site full of rescued people, a facility documented by a task force operating under emergency federal authorization, a medical intelligence witness with a clean chain of observation. Going back to 5 in the morning, a detained interagency liaison caught approaching a secured evidence site with 2 private personnel and a concealed drive. A pause. And you're about to find a drive in the gravel 11 meters east-northeast of your loading bay that has everything I just described. The line was quiet. The 3 names, Westbrook said, are on the drive, Carver Doyle said, in a file labeled primary. You'll want to have your immediate chain of command on the line before you open it. Another pause. Not because the names are going to be surprising, because the response is going to need to be very fast and very coordinated, and the people who need to know at the same time. The call ended. Westbrook stood up immediately and got on his secondary phone, the real one, the channel that Fane had never touched, and began talking, and Lena listened to the shape of what he was doing, which was building upward through a chain of authority, reporting up and out and away from any structural component that Fane could have contaminated. She heard him name the task force, the site, the evidence. She heard him describe the detained personnel. She heard him use words like imminent and primary and asset that in their specific technical context meant things were moving to a level above what she could observe directly. Outside, someone shouted, then radio noise, then a voice she recognized as the lead perimeter agent calling something in. The agent at the door listened to his earpiece. They found the drive, he said. She sat in the room where Fane had run his parallel operation and looked at the empty filing cabinet and thought about what was on a hard drive 11 meters from the loading bay. And she thought about Carver Doyle, terminated, removed, 4 years building alone. And she thought about the way he had said the names wouldn't be surprising, said it like he'd imagined this moment many times and knew exactly what expression it would produce. Westbrook came back into the room at a pace that was not quite a run, but had the quality of one. The drive is confirmed, he said. The file labeled primary is encrypted, but the key he provided opens it. He looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not shock, because he was too controlled for shock, but something adjacent to the version of shock that very experienced people allowed themselves. 2 of the 3 names are federal agency directors. The third, he stopped. The third, she said. The third is the sitting Deputy Attorney General for the Midwest Federal Judicial District, he said, who has oversight authority over every federal prosecution originating from this region. She looked at him. He would have buried it, she said. Before it reached a grand jury, Westbrook said. Yes. He sat back down. He put both phones on the desk. Doyle's communications records go back 4 years. They show explicit coordination between the Deputy AG's office and Rourke's financial entity, case referral diversions, prosecution timing delays, investigative closure authorizations, documented, sourced, time-stamped. She said nothing. The 2 agency directors were providing the intelligence access and the financial cover structure, he said. The Deputy AG was ensuring that even if the network was investigated, the investigation would never produce a prosecution. He looked at the secondary phone. I have the Inspector General's office on hold. I have the FBI Director's secure line queued, and I have approximately 12 minutes before any of this information has a chance of reaching anyone in the Deputy AG's network through a channel we haven't yet identified. What do you need from me? She said. Your formal statement, on record, starting from the moment you arrived at the Blackridge driveway this morning. He put his hand on the secondary phone. Everything you saw, everything you did, everything you were told, in sequence, starting with the officer who threw your badge in the dark. He paused. I need it clean, and I need it now. She looked at the window. The Nevada afternoon light was flat and white and relentless. She thought about Brett Kaminsky laughing, about Darren Coyle's voice on the phone, regardless, and the way that word had carried the full weight of every institution that had ever decided that a nurse's inconvenient presence was less important than protecting a relationship with money. She thought about a child's shoe on a concrete floor. She straightened in the chair, folded her hands on the desk, and looked at the agent who had been positioned at the door and who was now holding a recording device that Westbrook had given him. I arrived at the Blackridge estate at approximately 5:04 a.m., she said. Her voice was steady. I parked on the shoulder of the private access road and approached the perimeter tape on foot with my hospital identification visible. I was stopped by a county officer, turned away, and returned to my vehicle. I re-entered the perimeter at approximately 5:10 a.m., using a route that placed me behind a parked vehicle during a radio distraction. At approximately 5:11 a.m., Officer Brett Kaminsky of the Ravenport County Sheriff's Department grabbed me by the arm, forced me face down against the hood of an unmarked cruiser, and removed my hospital identification badge from my lanyard. He cuffed my wrists in front of my body, announced to the assembled personnel that I was just a nurse, and threw my badge into the dark. She paused. After that, she said, this is what happened. The statement took 41 minutes. She didn't rush it, and she didn't embellish it. She gave Westbrook's recorder exactly what she had: the sequence of events, the observations, the decisions, the medical interventions, the inferences she had drawn, and the evidence that supported each one. She noted when she was certain and when she was inferring and when she was operating on pattern recognition from her service rather than direct clinical evidence. She named Kaminsky by his full name and described what he had done with the specificity of a person who had spent years learning to observe under pressure. She named Coyle. She named Reeves. She described the folder, the room, the routing map, the payment schedule, the phone call, the drive in the gravel. When she was done, the agent at the door stopped the recording and looked at Westbrook, and Westbrook nodded, and the agent left the room with the device, and the statement went into a chain of custody that was cleaner than anything Fain had ever touched. Westbrook sat across from her and said nothing for a moment. "The Inspector General's office is active," he said finally. "The FBI Director's office has been briefed. The Deputy AG's access to federal prosecution systems has been suspended pending emergency review. That went through at 11 minutes, which is faster than I expected." He looked at the secondary phone on the desk. "Doyle's documentation is being processed by a team that has no connection to the Midwest regional structure. They're working in D.C. "What about Rourke?" she said. "Still no visual confirmation of location." He said it with the particular flatness of a man who found that unacceptable but had exhausted his immediate options. "His financial infrastructure is completely frozen. Accounts, assets, shell entities, all of it. His passport is flagged at every international crossing. We have surveillance on every property connected to him through 6 degrees of corporate separation." A pause. "He's somewhere that we haven't mapped yet." She thought about the caller's words. Contingency infrastructure, the place you didn't tell anyone about, the place that existed only in your head. Rourke had run a network sophisticated enough to sustain 6 years of operational security. He had planned for the possibility of exposure. He had a place. "Doyle," she said. "He's been inside the network for 3 years. Does he have Rourke's contingency location?" Westbrook looked at her. "That's a good question," he said. He picked up the secondary phone. She left the room while he made the call. The two agents shifted to follow her, and she didn't object because she understood their function and didn't have the energy to resist it. She walked to the facility's main corridor and stood by the large rolling door that led to the loading bay and looked out at the Nevada afternoon. The industrial corridor was full of federal vehicles now, a different landscape from the empty one she'd seen driving in. Yellow evidence flags dotted the gravel in a constellation that marked what had been found where. An ambulance was still staged at the far end of the lot, its rear doors open, 2 EMTs sitting on the bumper eating sandwiches from a cooler. Normal. Catastrophically abnormal, and also, at this moment, strangely normal. She thought about the 129 people who had been in this building this morning. She thought about where they were now, distributed across hospital systems, emergency shelters, consular contacts, the beginning of a process that would take months and in some cases years to complete. She thought about the woman whose blood pressure she had been measuring when Westbrook told her Coyle's name, and the way the woman had looked at her. Not with the specific fear of someone confronting danger, but with the quieter, harder fear of someone who had been afraid for so long that they had stopped registering it as a distinct sensation. She thought about the child's shoe. Westbrook came out of the room and walked toward her with a pace that told her something had changed. "Doyle has a location," he said. "He's been tracking Rourke's movements through the financial patterns. Specifically, a series of small cash movements over the last 8 months that didn't fit the operational expense pattern. Private payments, irregular, routed through a single intermediary entity that Doyle identified as a property management company." He stopped beside her at the loading bay door. "The company manages 4 properties. 3 of them are connected to Rourke through layers that the task force had already identified. The fourth is held under a name that has no visible connection to Rourke whatsoever. Where? She said. Eastern Oregon, outside a town called Del Mar. Rural property, 40 acres, no public road access. He looked at his phone. Doyle says the property was acquired 8 years ago, before the network's current structure was built, before any of this was on anyone's radar. He looked at her. He's been sitting on that location for 4 months waiting for the right moment. The right moment being now, she said. The right moment being a documented federal operation with a clean chain of custody and no remaining internal compromise, he said. Yes. She looked at the ambulance, at the EMTs on the bumper, at the yellow evidence flags in the gravel. Go, she said. He was already moving. She stayed at the facility for another 3 hours, working with Pruitt and the forensic medical team on the clinical infrastructure documentation. It was grinding work, methodical, necessary, the kind of work that didn't produce dramatic moments, but produced the evidentiary foundation that every subsequent proceeding would rest on. She logged each pharmaceutical compound, cross-referenced the procurement records against legitimate medical supply chains, identified the specific points at which Coyle's system had diverted controlled substances from legitimate distribution into the network's supply pipeline. She was thorough and she was accurate, and by the time she finished, her hands were steadier than they had been at noon, because concentrated technical work had always done that for her, burned off the residue of adrenaline and left something cleaner behind. At 5:47 p.m. local time, her phone buzzed with a number she recognized, Westbrook's secondary line. Rourke is in custody, he said. Del Mar, Oregon. He was in the main house when the team arrived. He didn't run. A pause. He didn't have anywhere left to run to. She stood in the pharmaceutical staging room with the phone at her ear and said nothing for a moment. Was anyone hurt? She said. No, he surrendered without resistance. Another pause, and something in Westbrook's voice shifted. Not emotion exactly, but the texture of someone allowing themselves to feel the weight of a thing fully, briefly, before putting it back down. He was alone. He'd been alone in that house for at least 18 hours. No staff, no security, no associates. Just a man in a 40-acre property in eastern Oregon watching the news on a laptop. She thought about that. About what it looked like to be the center of a 6-year criminal empire and to end up watching your own unraveling on a laptop screen in an empty house. She didn't feel satisfaction about it in the clean, simple way she'd imagined feeling satisfaction about things like this when she was younger. It was more complicated. Everything about this had been more complicated than it looked from the outside. Okay, she said. Okay, he agreed. She flew back to Minnesota the following morning on a commercial flight, economy class, window seat, because the task force transport had returned to D.C. with Westbrook and his team. She had a granola bar from the airport vending machine for breakfast and coffee that was worse than the field team's cooler coffee had been, and she sat with her forehead against the cold window and watched the landscape change from Nevada's flat paleness to the green and gray of the upper Midwest, and she slept for 40 minutes somewhere over Wyoming without intending to. She landed in Minneapolis at 1:22 p.m. A federal attorney was waiting for her at the gate, a woman named Okafor, small and precise, who introduced herself and handed Lena a business card and said, without ceremony, "You need legal representation before your formal deposition. I've been assigned to advise you on that process. You're not a subject of investigation. You're a key witness and a cooperating expert consultant. The distinction matters legally, and I need you to understand it clearly before you speak to anyone else formally." "I understand it," Lena said. "Good." Okafor fell into step beside her. "I also need to tell you that Halverson Medical Center's legal office has been in contact with the task force, specifically regarding the circumstances of your suspension yesterday morning." Lena looked at her. "Darren Coyle was their chief medical officer," Okafor said, "and the hospital is in the process of managing what his involvement means for their institutional liability. Part of that management involves clarifying their position regarding actions taken in his name while he was operating in bad faith." She paused. "The suspension of your badge access has been rescinded. Your employment record has been restored. The hospital's legal office would like to discuss the terms of your reinstatement." Lena looked at the terminal around her, the ordinary Tuesday afternoon of people moving with their luggage, talking on phones, looking at departure boards. "I'll think about it," she said. Okafor nodded, in the manner of someone who had expected that answer and considered it reasonable. The formal deposition process took 11 days. Not 11 days of continuous testimony, but 11 days of scheduled sessions, document reviews, cross-referencing, and the particular tedium of converting lived experience into legal language that could survive adversarial scrutiny. Okafor was good, sharp, prepared, the kind of attorney who read everything twice and asked questions that seemed simple until you realized they were structural. Lena gave the same account she had given into Westbrook's recorder in the Silver Mesa contact room, with additional detail and with the clinical specificity that Okafor said would matter at trial. She was deposed by 3 separate legal teams across those 11 days. The task force attorneys, the FBI's prosecutorial support division, and a team from the special counsel's office that had been appointed to oversee the prosecutions of the 2 agency directors and the deputy AG, a team that was operating under a level of institutional scrutiny that required them to document everything in triplicate and run their processes through a separate oversight mechanism, specifically to prevent any possibility of the kind of internal compromise that had allowed Fain to operate. It was, as systems went, imperfect. She knew that. The people building it knew it. The imperfection was the point. You built oversight of oversight of oversight, not because you believed it was foolproof, but because each additional layer raised the cost of compromise until the cost exceeded what anyone was willing to pay. She gave her testimony into each layer and was thorough and did not editorialize and did not perform and drove home each evening to her apartment in Ravenport and ate whatever was in her refrigerator, which during that period was mostly eggs and leftover rice, and once, memorably, an entire bag of frozen dumplings that she cooked at 10:30 at night because she'd forgotten to think about dinner until she was already exhausted. She was human. She forgot things. She ate frozen dumplings at 10:30 at night and sat on her couch with the television on mute and looked at the wall and thought about a child's shoe on a concrete floor until she made herself stop and think about something else. She did not always successfully make herself think about something else. The arraignments began in the 4th week. Victor Rourke was arraigned on federal charges that occupied 3 full pages of a formal indictment: racketeering, money laundering, conspiracy to commit trafficking, narcotics distribution across state lines, obstruction of justice, and 8 additional counts arising from specific documented actions during the network's 6-year operation. Bail was denied. He appeared in court in a suit that looked expensive even in poor courtroom lighting, and his attorneys filed 17 pretrial motions, and every one of them was reviewed by a judicial panel that had been constituted specifically to exclude any member with jurisdictional connection to the Midwest Federal District that the Deputy AG had overseen. The 2 agency directors were arraigned separately, in different districts, within 48 hours of each other. Their charges were narrower, focused on the specific documented acts of providing intelligence access and financial cover, but were supported by 4 years of Carver Doyle's communications records and the full decrypted contents of the financial schedule from the Silver Mesa folder. Neither of them had a credible avenue for suppressing the prosecution, because the oversight structure designed to suppress prosecutions in this region was itself under indictment. The Deputy AG resigned before his arraignment. His attorneys negotiated a cooperation agreement that required him to provide complete testimony about his interactions with Rourke's network in exchange for a sentencing recommendation. Not immunity, not a dismissal, but a recommendation that his cooperation be considered. He provided the testimony. The testimony was useful. He was still charged with 3 counts of obstruction and abuse of authority, and the cooperation agreement reduced what he faced but did not eliminate it. Darren Coyle entered a guilty plea in the 6th week. He had no viable defense. The financial records, the credential documentation, the pharmaceutical procurement records, and Lena's testimony had constructed a case that his attorneys described in a document they filed with the court as overwhelming in its evidentiary weight. He pled to conspiracy, falsification of medical records, obstruction, and accessory to trafficking charges arising from his role in the network's logistics. His medical license was revoked by the state board before sentencing, in a separate administrative proceeding that took less time than the legal process because the evidence was the same evidence and the board had less procedural complexity to navigate. Aldrich Fain was charged separately: conspiracy, obstruction, and a count arising from his approach to the Silver Mesa facility with concealed materials and private personnel while the site was under federal seal. His attorneys argued the approach had been authorized by his operational role. The recording of Westbrook's radio commands during the incident and the testimony of the two perimeter agents who had detained him did not support that argument. Officer Brett Kaminsky was charged through the county system, unlawful use of force, official misconduct, and a separate count arising from payments investigators found in his financial records connecting him to Rourke's private security operation. The payments had been running for 14 months. He had known, when he grabbed Lena by the collar in the dark and threw her badge into the gravel, who the estate belonged to and why it mattered that a nurse with a dispatch call record didn't get inside. The county system was slower than the federal one, and the charges were less dramatic, but they were charges, and they would be prosecuted. And when the local paper ran the story, which it did, with Kaminsky's photograph and a headline that Lena saw on her phone while waiting for coffee at a drive-thru, the comments section filled up within 4 hours with people who had their own stories about Kaminsky's particular brand of authority. She didn't read the comments. She had learned, in the years before all of this, that reading the comments was rarely a useful application of finite time. Carver Doyle surfaced publicly in the 8th week, when his role in the case became part of the official prosecutorial record. He gave a single interview to a journalist who had been covering federal financial crimes for 20 years, and who, Doyle had apparently decided, was unlikely to misrepresent what she was told. The interview ran long. In it, Doyle described 4 years of working alone after his removal from the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. Not dramatically, not as a heroic narrative, but as a practical account of a person who had identified a problem that the available institutions were structurally prevented from solving and had decided to solve it by building the kind of case that could not be refused. He had made errors. He said so in the interview. He had followed leads that went nowhere and spent months on analytical approaches that turned out to be wrong. He had been frightened at points, in ways he described with a matter-of-factness that was more affecting than emotional language would have been. He had also been angry, steadily, for 4 years, and the anger had been useful in the way that anger was sometimes useful, not as a fuel exactly, but as a compass, pointing consistently toward the thing that mattered most when everything else was disorienting. Lena read the interview on a Saturday morning at her kitchen table. She read it twice. She thought about the phone call in the Silver Mesa contact room and the voice that had been calm and specific and had known exactly what it needed from her and had asked for it directly. She thought about someone who had been removed, professionally dismantled, left with no institutional backing, and had responded by building a 4-year evidentiary case in private that ultimately took down a network that 3 federal agencies had failed to penetrate. She understood something about that, not the specifics, but the underlying shape of it, the experience of being told, in some effective operational way, that your presence and your knowledge and your capacity were inconvenient and should be made to disappear, and the particular quality of response that experience could produce in a person who refused to let it. She had experienced a version of it at 5 in the morning on a gravel driveway in the space of 45 minutes, and it had lasted a day. Doyle had experienced a version of it that had lasted 4 years. She made herself a second cup of coffee and thought about what she was going to do next. The hospital's legal office had contacted her 3 times since Okafor had relayed their initial communication. The third contact had come from the hospital's board chair directly, a woman named Greta Halverson, the granddaughter of the hospital's founder, who called Lena on her personal number on a Tuesday evening and did not open with a legal framing. She opened with an apology that was direct and specific, and that named what Coyle had done and what the hospital's response to Lena's suspension had enabled, without hedging or redirecting into institutional language. "We made a decision to protect a relationship," Halverson said, "at the cost of a person doing her job correctly. That's not something I can fix retroactively. I can only tell you that I understand what happened, and I'm telling you directly." Lena had appreciated that. She had said so. "Your position is open," Halverson said. "Your credentials are fully restored with a formal notation in your record documenting the circumstances of the temporary suspension and its rescission. If you want to come back, we want you back." "I'll think about it," Lena said. The same answer she'd given Okafor, the honest one. "Take the time you need," Halverson said. She thought about it for 3 weeks. She thought about the patients she had left behind when the suspension hit, the ones she had been mid-cycle with, whose cases she had handed off to colleagues who were competent but didn't know the specific history. She thought about the particular satisfaction of trauma nursing, which was not a clean satisfaction, but a real one. The satisfaction of a skill applied at the exact moment it was needed. The way the margin between a good outcome and a bad one was often exactly the width of the right training in the right hands at the right time. She thought about Agent Ferris, breathing steadily on the gravel driveway because she had been there. She thought about the task force. Westbrook called her in the 9th week. Not about the case was in the hands of prosecutors, and her formal role as a witness was complete for the moment. He called about something else. "We're building a permanent medical intelligence unit," he said, "within the task force structure but with a broader mandate, specifically focused on operations where criminal networks use medical and pharmaceutical infrastructure as cover or logistics. The kind of thing that keeps getting missed because most federal investigators don't have the clinical background to identify it when they see it." A pause. "We need someone to help design the assessment protocols and the training curriculum. Someone who can read a room the way you read the sub-basement at Blackridge." She was quiet for a moment. "What would that look like?" she said. "Part-time to start," he said. "Consultant structure. You'd keep your clinical work, if you go back to clinical work, and this would be the other part. Travel when operations require it, the rest remote." A pause. "It pays less than you'd expect and requires more than the title suggests. Standard federal consultant arrangement." "I'd need to design the protocols myself," she said, "not adapt someone else's framework." "That's exactly what I'm asking you to do," he said. She looked at the window of her apartment. November had arrived while she wasn't paying attention to seasons, and the trees on the street outside had gone bare, and the afternoon light was the low flat light of a Minnesota late autumn that looked cold even through glass. "I'll do both," she said, "the hospital and the unit, if the schedule can be structured." "I'll make the schedule work," he said. She went back to Halverson Medical on a Monday morning in the 11th week at 7 a.m., in the same scrubs she'd always worn, with her badge clipped to her jacket and her bag over her shoulder. The lobby was the same lobby it had always been. The same linoleum, the same reception desk, the same elevator that took 40 seconds longer than it should have on the way to the 3rd floor. The plaque from the pediatric wing dedication was gone from the wall. She noticed that without surprise. She was met at the nursing station on the 3rd floor by the charge nurse, a woman named Sue, who had worked the floor for 11 years, and who greeted Lena with the specific practicality of someone who had held a unit together in the absence of a colleague and was glad to hand part of it back. "We have a patient in room 12 who's been a nightmare for the overnight staff," Sue said, by way of welcome. "Complex medication history, doesn't trust anyone, and has a tendency to pull his monitoring leads when he thinks nobody's watching." "What's his underlying?" Lena said. "Cardiac? Complicated by unmanaged hypertension and what appears to be a persistent conviction that he knows more about his own treatment than anyone with a medical degree." "What floor is he on?" "3rd. "So mine," Lena said. "So yours," Sue agreed. She went to room 12. The patient, a man in his 60s, heavy-set, with the specific expression of someone who had decided before she walked in that she wasn't going to tell him anything he didn't already know, looked at her badge and then at her face and said, "You're new." "I'm not new," she said. "I've been away. I'm back." She sat on the edge of the chair by his bed, which put her at his eye level rather than above it, and opened his chart on the tablet. "Walk me through what you've been telling the overnight staff about your medication history, because I want to hear it from you rather than from the chart." He looked at her for a moment. Then he started talking. That was her morning, then the afternoon, then the week, and the week after that, and the work that didn't resolve dramatically or conclude neatly but accumulated, case by case, shift by shift, in the way that most real work accumulated, imperfectly and incrementally and with more uncertainty than the outcome, viewed later, ever suggested. In the same weeks, she began designing the medical intelligence assessment protocols for the task force. She worked on them in the evenings, at her kitchen table, with the same methodical attention she had given to the evidentiary documentation in Silver Mesa. She was building a framework for identifying the specific markers of clinical infrastructure being used for criminal concealment, the inventory organization patterns, the procurement anomalies, the documentation architecture, the things that trained medical eyes could read in 30 seconds that took financial investigators months to reconstruct from paper records. She built it from first principles, from her service training, from everything she had seen in the Blackridge sub-basement and the Silver Mesa facility, and the years between her discharge and the morning on the driveway when a man had thrown her badge into the dark and expected her to walk away. She thought about that sometimes. Not obsessively, not with the sustained focus that would have been unhealthy, but in the way you thought about experiences that had changed the geography of your understanding. Not events you dwelled on, but events you returned to occasionally, turning them over, trying to extract the last of what they had to teach. What she kept arriving at was not what she had expected to arrive at. She had expected to arrive at something about justice, or about vindication, or about the specific satisfaction of being recognized after being dismissed. Those things were real, and she had felt them. But underneath them was something more structural than satisfaction. She had been told, at 5 a.m. on a gravel driveway, that she was just a nurse. The man who said it had meant it as a diminishment, a declaration that her training, her knowledge, her presence at that location at that moment were insufficient to matter. That the category she occupied, nurse, woman, civilian, person without a badge or a weapon or an institutional authority, was a category that could be physically pushed aside and left in the dark. What had happened in the hours after that was not a story about a nurse becoming something more than a nurse. She had not needed to become anything. She had arrived at that driveway already being what she was, a person with specific and extensive training, with a capacity for precise observation, with years of experience in conditions that had required her to think clearly, under pressure, and make decisions with inadequate information and keep going when the situation was harder than anyone outside it could fully see. The man who threw her badge into the dark had not changed any of that. He had simply been wrong about what he was looking at. That was what she kept arriving at. Not that she had proven herself, not that the dismissal had been reversed, but that the dismissal had been wrong from the first moment, and all the reversal had done was make the wrongness visible to people who hadn't been able to see it before. She thought about the other women on her floor, the nurses, the CNAs, the technicians, who went through their work every day being what they were, competent and trained and genuinely necessary, and were not always recognized for it, and kept going anyway. She thought about what it meant that the systems designed to protect people could be compromised by the same prejudices that made a man laugh at a badge in the dark. And she thought about what it meant to build something, a protocol, a framework, a case that made those systems harder to compromise, not by making them perfect, because nothing was perfect, but by making them require more from the people who tried to exploit them. Victor Rourke was sentenced 14 months after his arraignment. The trial had been long and the defense had been well-resourced, and the jury had deliberated for 11 days before returning verdicts on all counts. He received consecutive sentences that amounted, under federal guidelines, to a term that his attorneys had described as functionally life equivalent. His remaining assets, the ones that hadn't been seized at the time of arrest, were ordered forfeited. The foundation bearing his name was dissolved by court order. The pediatric wing at Halverson Medical, whose donors subsequently learned how it had been funded, was quietly renamed. Kaminsky was convicted in the county proceeding and sentenced to prison. The payments connecting him to Rourke's security operation had been the decisive element. What might have been argued as an overzealous law enforcement action became something more specific and more indefensible when the financial record was introduced. He had known. He had been paid to know and to act accordingly. The jury took less time with his case than the federal jury had taken with Rourke's. Fine received a sentence in the federal system. Coyle received a sentence. The two agency directors received sentences, reduced slightly by their cooperation, but not eliminated by it. The deputy AG received a sentence, reduced by his cooperation agreement to something shorter than the others, but still enough to end the career and life trajectory he had built over 30 years. The 129 people from the Silver Mesa facility were not, most of them, a story that resolved cleanly. Some of them were reunited with family members within weeks. Some of them entered long-term support systems that would take years to navigate. Some of them had documentation issues that required consular intervention and legal assistance and the kind of sustained institutional support that didn't generate headlines but required enormous amounts of sustained work from people doing it without recognition. The task force maintained a case management structure for the population as a whole for 18 months after the initial rescue, and Lena contributed to the medical component of that structure, not as a primary operator, but as an advisor on the clinical needs assessment protocol that guided the health support system. She met some of them. Not all, not most. That wasn't the kind of contact that was appropriate or helpful in most cases. But some. A few of the adults who had been in the Silver Mesa facility and who were, by the 8th month, in stable situations and who had been told that the nurse who had first assessed them inside the building was one of the people whose testimony had built the case. A few of them asked to meet her. She met them in a conference room at a support organization's office in Minneapolis. 3 adults. 2 of them spoke through an interpreter. 1 spoke English well enough to dispense with that. The one who spoke English was a woman in her 40s whose name Lena had seen in the case record and who sat across from her in the conference room with her hands folded on the table and looked at Lena with an expression that Lena didn't know how to receive, which was the expression of someone trying to convey something for which they hadn't yet found the right language. "I saw you," the woman said. "Inside, when you came in. You were moving. You were checking people, looking at each person." "Yes," Lena said. "You looked at me," the woman said. "You looked at me and you said—" She stopped. "You said, 'I see you.' Do you remember that?" Lena had not remembered saying it. She had been in full triage mode when she entered that room. Scanning, assessing, moving fast. She might have said it. She might have said it the way you said things in those moments that came from somewhere below conscious language. "I believe you," she said. The woman nodded. She looked at the table for a moment. "It was the first thing in a long time," she said, "that someone saw me." She paused. "I wanted to say that." Lena sat with that. She didn't try to respond with the right thing because she wasn't sure what the right thing was, and she had learned to distrust the impulse toward the right thing when the human thing was available. She just sat with it and nodded and let it mean what it meant. Carver Doyle received a formal commendation from the Inspector General's office and was offered reinstatement at the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. He declined the reinstatement. He accepted the commendation in a brief ceremony and then went back to whatever he was working on next, which he described to the journalist who had covered his original interview as a different problem with the same underlying structure. She published that quote without elaboration because it didn't need any. Lena was driving to work one morning in February. The flat gray February of a Minnesota that hadn't decided yet whether it was almost done with winter. When she passed the intersection near Halverson Medical, where there was a bus shelter that had been there as long as she'd been working at the hospital. She had passed it 1,000 times. A woman was standing at the shelter with 2 children, both of them in winter coats too thin for the temperature, and one of the children was pulling at the other's sleeve and laughing at something that Lena couldn't see. She had a green light. She drove through it. She thought about that image on and off for the rest of the day, in the way you thought about images that caught something true. Not dramatic, not exceptional, just true. A woman at a bus shelter in the cold with 2 children and a thin coat and a child laughing. The ordinary human difficulty of moving through a world that regularly failed the people in it, and the way people moved through it anyway, finding the things worth finding in the spaces the difficulty left open. She had been told she was just a nurse by a man who believed the word "just" contained a ceiling. She had spent the intervening months discovering that the ceiling had always been his imagination and not her architecture, that what she had built in years of training and work and the accumulated practice of showing up and seeing people and doing what needed to be done had never been small. It had only been invisible to people who needed to see a badge before they could see a person. She didn't think about it with anger anymore, mostly. The anger had been real and had been useful, the way Doyle's anger had been useful, as a compass, not a fuel. It had pointed her toward what mattered when she was on a gravel driveway at 5 in the morning with her wrists in cuffs and her badge in the dark, and every institutional signal telling her that the appropriate response was to stand down and walk away. She had not walked away. That was the whole of it, and it was enough. She pulled into the hospital parking structure, killed the engine, picked up her bag, and went to work.